Unit 3, Deconstructing the Will. Section 1, Wegener's Theory. In this unit, we're going to look first at Daniel Wegener's attempt to understand our human sense of having a will, and then at how science has reconstructed both our notion of self-awareness and our sense of owning an embodied self. Although Wegener is clearly a believer in the scientific mainstream view of the will, he is by no means dismissive of our subjective sense of the effectiveness of the conscious will. Indeed, Wegener is keen that science should also address the phenomena of people's strongly held beliefs regarding the power of conscious will. As he says, quote, "The idea of conscious will and the idea of psychological mechanisms have never been properly reconciled. One way to put them together is to say that the mechanistic approach is the explanation preferred for scientific purposes, but that the person's experience of conscious will is utterly convincing and important to the person, and so must be understood scientifically as well." End quote. Wegener quotes David Hume's insistence that will is best seen as a feeling. Hume indeed defined the will as, quote, "nothing but the internal impression we feel and are conscious of when we knowingly give rise to any new motion of our body or new perception of our mind." End quote, 1737. Hume's definition, as Wegener says, quote, "puts the person's experience at the very center of the whole concept. The will is not some cause or force or motor in a person, but rather is the personal conscious feeling of such causing, forcing, or motoring." Hume's definition makes sense because the occurrence of this conscious experience is an absolute must for anyone to claim they've done something that they consciously willed. Without an experience of willing, even actions that look entirely voluntary from the outside will fall short of qualifying as truly willed. Consciously willing an action requires a feeling of doing, a kind of internal umph that somehow certifies authentically that one has done the action. End quote. Wegener coins the term empirical will to mark the difference between it and phenomenal will. As he says, quote, "We must be careful to distinguish between such empirical will, the causality of the person's conscious thoughts as established by a scientific analysis of their covariation with the person's behavior, and the phenomenal will, the person's reported experience of will. The empirical will can be measured by examining the actual degree of constant conjunction between the person's self-reported conscious thought and the person's action. And by assessing the causal role of that thought in the context of other possible causes of the action and possible causes of the thought as well. But the precise causal understanding of the conscious will that is captured in such discussions is not something that is linked in any direct way to the person's experience of will, end quote. So action or empirical will and the feeling of willing, phenomenal will, generally occur together so that we don't notice the difference between them. However, they are not locked together inevitably. They come apart often enough in automisms and illusions of control to indicate that they may be produced by separate systems in the mind. Quote, the processes of mind that produce the experience of will may be quite distinct from the processes of mind that produce the action itself. As soon as we accept the idea that the will should be understood as an experience of the person who acts, we realize that conscious will is not inherent in action. There are actions that have it and actions that don't, end quote.